Check, check. Mic check. Check, check. Mic check. Check, check. Mic check. Across the river and into the trees. To marry with love. Note, in view of a recent tendency to identify characters in fiction with real people, it seems proper to state that there are no real people in this volume. Both the characters and their names are fictitious. The names or designations of any military units are fictitious. There are no living people nor existing military units presented in this book. Chapter 1. They started 2 hours before daylight, and at first it was not necessary to break the ice across the canal, as other boats had gone on ahead. In each boat, in the darkness, so you could not see, but only hear him, the poler stood in the stern with his long oar. The shooter sat on a shooting stool fastened to the top of a box that contained his lunch and shells, and the shooter's 2 or more guns were propped against the load of wooden decoys. Somewhere in each boat there was a sack with 1 or 2 live mallard hens, or a hen and a drake, and in each boat there was a dog who shifted and shivered uneasily at the sound of the wings of the ducks that passed overhead in the darkness. 4 of the boats went on up the main canal toward the big lagoon to the north. A 5th boat had already turned off into a side canal. Now the 6th boat turned south into a shallow lagoon, and there was no broken water. It was all ice, new frozen during the sudden windless cold of the night. It was rubbery and bending against the thrust of the boatman's oar. Then it would break as sharply as a pane of glass, but the boat made little forward progress. "Give me an oar," the shooter in the 6th boat said. He stood up and braced himself carefully. He could hear the ducks passing in the darkness and feel the restless lurching of the dog. To the north he heard the sound of breaking ice from the other boats. "Be careful," the poler in the stern said. "Don't tip the boat over." "I am a boatman too," the shooter said. He took the long oar the boatman handed him and reversed it so he could hold it by the blade. Holding the blade, he reached forward and punched the handle through the ice. He felt the firm bottom of the shallow lagoon, put his weight on the top of the wide oar blade, and holding with both hands, and first pulling, then shoving, until the pole hold was well to the stern, he drove the boat ahead to break the ice. The ice broke like sheets of plate glass as the boat drove into it and onto it, and astern, the boatman shoved them ahead into the broken passage. After a while, the shooter, who was working hard and steadily and sweating in his heavy clothes, asked the boatman, "Where is the shooting barrel?" "Off there to the left, in the middle of the next bay." "Should I turn for it now?" "As you wish." What do you mean, as I wish? You know the water. Is there water to carry us there? The tide is low. Who knows? It will be daylight before we get there if we don't hurry. The boatman did not answer. All right, you surly jerk, the shooter thought to himself. We are going to get there. We've made 2/3 of the way now. If you are worried about having to work to break ice to pick up birds, that is altogether too bad. Get your back into it. Get your back in it, jerk, he said in English. What? The boatman asked in Italian. I said, let's go. It's going to be light. It was daylight before they reached the oaken staved hogshead sunk in the bottom of the lagoon. It was surrounded by a sloping rim of earth that had been planted with sedge and grass, and the shooter swung carefully up onto this, feeling the frozen grasses break as he stepped on them. The boatman lifted the combination shooting stool and shell box out of the boat and handed it to the shooter, who leaned over and placed it in the bottom of the big barrel. The shooter, wearing his hip boots and an old combat jacket with a patch on the left shoulder that no one understood, and with the slight light places on the straps where stars had been removed, climbed down into the barrel, and the boatman handed him his 2 guns. He placed them against the wall of the barrel and hung his other shell bag between them, hanging it on 2 hooks built into the wall of the sunken barrel. Then he leaned the guns against each other, against each side of the shell bag. Is there water? He asked the boatman. No water, the boatman said. Can you drink the lagoon water? No, it is unhealthy. The shooter was thirsty from the hard work of breaking the ice and driving the boat in, and he felt his anger rise, and then held it and said, Can I help you in the boat to break ice to put out the decoys? No, the boatman said, and shoved the boat savagely out onto the thin sheet ice that cracked and ripped as the boat drove up onto it. The boatman commenced smashing at the ice with the blade of his oar, and then started tossing decoys out to the side and behind him. He's in a beautiful mood, the shooter thought. He's big. He's a big brute, too. I worked like a horse coming out here. He just pulled his weight, and that's all. What the hell is eating him? This is his trade, isn't it? He arranged the shooting stool so he would have the maximum swing to left and right, opened a box of shells and filled his pockets, and opened another of the boxes of shells in the shell bag so he could reach into it easily. In front of him, where the lagoon lay glazed in the first light, was the black boat and the tall, heavily built boatman smashing with his oar at the ice and tossing decoys overboard, as though he were ridding himself of something obscene. It was getting lighter now, and the shooter could see the low line of the near point across the lagoon. Beyond that point, he knew there were 2 other shooting posts, and far beyond it there was more marsh and then the open sea. He loaded both his guns and checked the position of the boat that was putting out decoys. From behind him, he heard the incoming whisper of wings, and he crouched. Took hold of his right-hand gun with his right hand as he looked up from under the rim of the barrel, then stood to shoot at the 2 ducks that were dropping down, their wings set to break, coming down dark in the gray dim sky, slanting toward the decoys. His head low, he swung the gun on a long slant down, well in ahead of the second duck. Then, without looking at the result of his shot, he raised his gun smoothly up, up ahead, and to the left of the other duck that was climbing to the left, and as he pulled, saw it fold in flight and drop among the decoys in the broken ice. He looked to his right and saw the first duck, a black patch on the same ice. He knew he had shot carefully on the first duck, far to the right of where the boat was, and on the second, high out and to the left, letting the duck climb far up and to the left to be sure the boat was out of any line of fire. It was a lovely double, shot exactly as he should have shot, with complete consideration and respect for the position of the boat, and he felt very good as he reloaded. "Listen," the man in the boat called. "Don't shoot toward the boat." "I'll be a sad son of a bitch," the shooter said to himself. "I will indeed." "Get your decoys out," he called to the man in the boat. "But get them out fast. I won't shoot until they are all out, except straight overhead." The man in the boat said nothing that could be heard. "I can't figure it," the shooter thought to himself. "He knows the game. He knows I split the work, or more, coming out. I never shot a safer or more careful duck in my life than that. What's the matter with him? I offered to put the deeks out with him. The hell with him." Out on the right now, the boatman was still chopping angrily at the ice and tossing out the wooden decoys in a hatred that showed in every move he made. "Don't let him spoil it," the shooter told himself. "There won't be much shooting with this ice unless the sun should melt it later on. You probably will only have a few birds, so don't let him spoil it for you. You don't know how many more times you will shoot ducks, and do not let anything spoil it for you." He watched the sky lightening beyond the long point of marsh, and turning in the sunken barrel, he looked out across the frozen lagoon and the marsh, and saw the snow-covered mountains a long way off. Low as he was, no foothills showed, and the mountains rose abruptly from the plain. As he looked toward the mountains, he could feel a breeze on his face, and he knew then the wind would come from there, rising with the sun, and that some birds would surely come flying in from the sea when the wind disturbed them. The boatman had finished putting out the decoys. They were in two bunches, one straight ahead and to the left toward where the sun would rise, and the other to the shooter's right. Now he dropped over the hen, Mallard, with her string and anchor, and the calling duck bobbed her head under water, and raising and dipping her head, splashed water onto her back. "Don't you think it would be good to break more ice around the edges?" the shooter called to the boatman. "There's not much water to attract them." The boatman said nothing, but commenced to smash at the jagged perimeter of ice with his oar. This ice breaking was unnecessary, and the boatman knew it, but the shooter did not know it, and he thought, "I do not understand him, but I must not let him ruin it. I must keep it entire and not let him do it. Every time you shoot now can be the last shoot, and no stupid son of a bitch should be allowed to ruin it. Keep your temper, boy," he told himself. Chapter 2. But he was not a boy. He was 50 and a colonel of infantry in the Army of the United States, and to pass a physical examination that he had to take the day before, he came down to Venice for this shoot. He had taken enough mannitol hexanitrate to, well, he did not quite know what to pass, he said to himself. The surgeon had been quite skeptical, but he noted the readings after taking them twice. You know, Dick, he said, it isn't indicated. In fact, it is definitely contraindicated in increased intraocular and intracranial pressure. I don't know what you are talking about, the shooter, who was not a shooter then, except potentially, and was a colonel of infantry in the Army of the United States, reduced from being a general officer, said. I have known you a long time, Colonel, or maybe it just seems a long time, the surgeon told him. It's been a long time, the colonel said. You sound like songwriters, the surgeon said, but don't you ever run into anything or let any sparks strike you when you're really souped up on nitroglycerin? They ought to make you drag a chain like a high-octane truck. Wasn't my cardiograph okay? The colonel asked. Your cardiograph was wonderful, Colonel. It could have been that of a man of 25. It might have been that of a boy of 19. Then what are you talking about? The colonel asked. That much mannitol hexanitrate produced a certain amount of nausea sometimes, and he was anxious for the interview to terminate. He was also anxious to lie down and take a seconal. I ought to write the manual of minor tactics for the heavy pressure platoon, he thought. Wish I could tell him that. Why don't I just throw myself on the mercy of the court? You never do, he told himself. You always plead them non-guilty. How many times have you been hit in the head? The surgeon asked him. You know, the colonel told him. It's my 201st. How many times have you been hit on the head? Oh, Christ. Then he said, you were asking for the army or as my physician? As your physician. You didn't think I'd try to wind your clock, did you? Didn't think I'd try to wind your clock, did you? No, Wes. I'm sorry. Just, what was it you wanted to know? Concussions. Real ones? Anytime you were cold or couldn't remember afterwards. Maybe 10, the colonel said. Counting polo. Give or take 3. You poor old son of a bitch, the surgeon said. Colonel, sir, he added. Can I go now? The colonel asked. Yes, sir, the surgeon said. You're in good shape. Thanks, the colonel said. Want to go on a duck shoot down in the marshes at the mouth of the Tagliamento? Wonderful shoot. Some nice Italian kids I met up at Cortina own it. Is that where they shoot coots? No, they shoot real ducks at this one. Good kids. Good shoot. Real ducks. Mallard, pintail, widgeon, some geese. Just as good as at home when we were kids. I was kids in 29 and 30. That's the first mean thing I ever heard you say. I didn't mean it like that. I just meant I didn't remember when duck shooting was good. I'm a city boy, too. That's the only goddamn trouble with you, too. I never saw a city boy yet that was worth a damn. You don't mean that, do you, Colonel? Of course not. You know damn well I don't. You're in good shape, Colonel, the surgeon said. I'm sorry I can't go on the shoot. I can't even shoot. Hell, said the colonel. Doesn't make any difference. Neither can anybody else in this army. I'd like to have you around. I'll give you something else to back up what you're using. Is there anything? Not really. They're working on stuff, though. Let them work, the colonel said. I think that's a laudable attitude, sir. Go to hell, the colonel said. You sure you don't want to go? I get my ducks at Longchamps on Madison Avenue, the surgeon said. It's air conditioned in the summer, and it's warm in the winter, and I don't have to get up before first light and wear long horned underwear. All right, city boy. You'll never know. I never wanted to know, the surgeon said. You're in good shape, Colonel, sir. Thanks, said the colonel, and went out. Chapter 3. That was day before yesterday. Yesterday he had driven down from Trieste to Venice along the old road that ran from Monfalcone to Latisana and across the flat country. He had a good driver, and he relaxed completely in the front seat of the car and looked out at all this country he had known when he was a boy. It looks quite differently now, he thought. I suppose it is because the distances are all changed. Everything is much smaller when you are older. Then, too, the roads are better now, and there is no dust. The only times I used to ride through it was in a camion. The rest of the times we walked. I suppose what I looked for then was patches of shade when we fell out, and wells in farmyards, and ditches, too, he thought. I certainly looked for plenty of ditches. They made a curve and crossed the Tagliamento on a temporary bridge. It was green along the banks, and men were fishing along the far shore where it ran deep. The blown bridge was being repaired with a snarl of riveting hammers, and 800 yards away, the smashed buildings and outbuildings of what was now a ruined country house, once built by Longhena, showed where the mediums had dropped their loads. Look at it, the driver said. In this country you find a bridge or a railway station. Then you go half a mile from it in any direction, and you find it like that. I guess the lesson is, the colonel said, don't ever build yourself a country house or a church or hire a Giotto to paint you any frescoes if you've got a church 800 yards away from any bridge. I knew there must be a lesson in it, sir, the driver said. They were past the ruined villa now, and onto the straight road with the willows growing by the ditches, still dark with winter, and the fields full of mulberry trees. Ahead a man was pedaling a bicycle and using both his hands to read a paper. If there are heavies, the lesson ought to say a mile, the driver said. Would that be about right, sir? If it's guided missiles, the colonel said. Better make it 250 miles. Better give that cyclist some horn. The driver did, and the man moved over to the side of the road without either looking up or touching his handlebars as they passed him. The colonel tried to see what paper he was reading, but it was folded over. I guess a man would do better now not to build himself a fine house or a church, or to get, who did you say it was, to paint frescoes? Giotto, I said. But it could be Piero della Francesca, or Mantegna. Could be Michelangelo. Do you know a lot about painters, sir? The driver asked. They were on a straight stretch of road now and were making time so that one farm blended, almost blurred, into another farm, and you could only see what was far ahead and moving toward you. Lateral vision was just a condensation of flat, low country in the winter. I'm not sure I like speed, the colonel thought. Brookhale would have been in a hell of a shape if he had to look at the country like this. Painters, he answered the driver. I know quite a little about them, Burnham. I'm Jackson, sir. Burnham's up at the rest center at Cortina. That's a fine place, sir. I'm getting stupid, the colonel said. Excuse me, Jackson. It is a fine place. Good chow, well run. Nobody bothers you. Yes, sir, Jackson agreed. Now, the reason I asked you about painters is these Madonnas. I thought I ought to see some painting, so I went to that big place in Florence. The Uffizi. The PT? Whatever they call it. The biggest one. And I kept looking at those paintings until Madonnas started to run out of my ears. I tell you, Colonel, sir, a man who hasn't been checked out on his painting can only see just about so many Madonnas, and it gets him. You know my theory? You know how crazy they are about Bambinis, and the less they got to eat, the more Bambinis they got, and that they have coming? Well, I think these painters were probably big Bambini lovers, like all Italians. I don't know these ones you mentioned just now, so I don't include them in my theory, and you'll put me straight anyway. But it looks to me like these Madonnas that I really saw plenty of, sir. It looks to me like these just straight ordinary Madonna painters were sort of a manifest, say, of this whole Bambini business, if you understand what I mean. Plus the fact they were restricted to religious subjects. Yes, sir. When you think there is something. Yes, sir. Then you think there is something to my theory. Sure. I think it is a little more complicated, though. Naturally, sir. It's just my preliminary theory. Do you have any other theories on Art Jackson? No, sir. That Bambini theory is as far as I've thought it through. What I wish is, though, they would paint some good pictures of that high country up around the rest center at Cortina. Titian came from up there, the colonel said. At least they say he did. I went down the valley and saw the house where he was supposed to be born. Was it much of a place, sir? Not so much. Well, if he painted any pictures of that country up around there, with those sunset color rocks and the pines and the snow and all the pointed steeples. Campaniles, the colonel said. Like that one ahead at Seguia. It means bell tower. Well, if he painted any really good pictures of that country, I'd sure as hell like to trade him out of some of them. He painted some wonderful women, the colonel said. If I had a joint or a roadhouse or some sort of an inn, say, I could use one of those, the driver said. But if I brought home a picture of some woman, my old woman would run me from Rawlins to Buffalo. I'd be lucky if I got to Buffalo. You could give it to the local museum. All they got in the local museum is arrowheads, war bonnets, scalping knives, different scalps, petrified fish, pipes of peace, photographs of liver-eating Johnston, and the skin of some bad man that they hanged him, and some doctor skinned him out. One of those women pictures would be out of place there. See that next campanile down there across the plain? The colonel said. I'll show you a place down there where we used to fight when I was a kid. Do you fight here too, sir? Yeah, the colonel said. Who had Trieste in that war? The Krauts. Austrians, I mean. Did we ever get it? Not till the end, when it was over. Who had Florence and Rome? We did. Well, I guess you weren't so damned bad off then. Sir, the colonel said gently. Sorry, sir, the driver said quickly. I was in the 36th Division, sir. I've seen the patch. I was thinking about the Rapido, sir. I didn't mean to be insolent or lacking in respect. You weren't, the colonel said. You were just thinking about the Rapido. Listen, Jackson, everybody who's soldiered a long time has had their Rapidos in more than one. I couldn't take more than one, sir. The car went through the cheerful town of Sandona di Piave. It was built up and new, but no more ugly than a middle western town, and it was as prosperous and as cheery as Fosalta. Just up the river, as miserable and gloomy, the colonel thought. Did Fosalta never get over the First War? I never saw it before it was smacked, he thought. They shelled it badly before the big 15th of June offensive in 18. When we shelled it really badly before we retook it. He remembered how the attack had taken off from Monastir, gone through Fornace, and on this winter day he remembered how it had been that summer. A few weeks ago, he had gone through Fosalta and had gone out along the sunken road to find the place where he had been hit, out on the river bank. It was easy to find because of the bend of the river and where the heavy machine gun post had been. The crater was smoothly grassed. It had been cropped by sheep or goats until it looked like a designed depression in a golf course. The river was slow and muddy blue here, with reeds along the edges, and the colonel, no one being in sight, squatted low and looking across the river from the bank where you could never show your head in daylight, relieved himself in the exact place where he had determined by triangulation that he had been badly wounded 30 years before. A poor effort, he said aloud to the river and the river bank that were heavy with autumn quiet and wet from the fall rains, but my own. He stood up and looked around. There was no one in sight, and he had left the car down the sunken road in front of the last and saddest rebuilt house in Fosalta. Now I'll complete the monument, he said, to no one but the dead, and he took an old Solingen clasp knife, such as German poachers carry, from his pocket. It locked on opening, and twirling it, he dug a neat hole in the moist earth. He cleaned the knife on his right combat boot, and then inserted a brown 10,000 lira note in the hole, and tamped it down, and put the grass that he had cored out over it. That is 25 years at 500 lira a year for the Medaglia de Argento al Valor Militaire. The VC carries 10 guineas, I believe. The DSC is non-productive. The Silver Star is free. I'll keep the change, he said. It's fine now, he thought. It has merde, money, blood. Look how that grass grows, and the irons in the earth, along with Gino's leg, both of Randolfo's legs, and my right kneecap. It's a wonderful monument. It has everything: fertility, money, blood, and iron. Sounds like a nation. Where fertility, money, blood, and iron is, there is the fatherland. We need coal, though. We ought to get some coal. Then he looked across the river to the rebuilt white house that had once been rubble, and he spat in the river. It was a long spit, and he just made it. I couldn't spit that night, nor afterwards for a long time, he said, but I spit good now for a man who doesn't chew. He walked slowly back to where the car was parked. The driver was asleep. Wake up, son, he said. Turn her around and take that road towards Treviso. We don't need a map on this part. I'll give you the turns. Four. Now, on his way into Venice, they said his name, right? Wes. Now, on his way into Venice, keeping strictly controlled and unthinking his great need to be there, the big Buick cleared the last of Sandona and came up onto the bridge over the Piave. Chapter 4, by the way. They crossed the bridge and were on the Italian side of the river, and he saw the old sunken road again. It was as smooth and undistinguished now as it was all along the river, but he could see the old positions. And now, along each side of the straight, flat, canal-bordered road they were making time on were the willows of the two canals that had contained the dead. There had been a great killing at the last of the offensive, and someone, to clear the river bank positions on the road in the hot weather, had ordered the dead thrown into the canals. Unfortunately, the canal gates were still in the Austrians' hands down the river, and they were closed. So there was little movement to the water, and the dead had stayed there a long time, floating and bloating, face up and face down, regardless of nationality, until they had attained colossal proportions. Finally, after organization had been established, labor troops hauled them out at night and buried them close to the road. The colonel looked for added greenness close to the road, but could not note any. However, there were many ducks and geese in the canals, and men were fishing in them all along the road. They dug them all up anyway, the colonel thought, and buried them in that big osario up by Nervesa. We fought along here when I was a kid, the colonel told the driver. It's a goddamn flat country to fight in, the driver said. Do you hold that river? Yes, the colonel said. We held it and lost it and took it back again. There isn't a contour here as far as you can see. That was the trouble, the colonel said. You had to use contours you couldn't see. They were so small. And ditches and houses and canal banks and hedgerows. It was like Normandy, only flatter. I think it must have been something like fighting in Holland. That river sure doesn't look anything like the Rapido. It was a pretty good old river, the colonel said. Up above it had plenty of water then, before all these hydroelectric projects. And it had very deep and tricky channels in the pebbles and shingle when it was shallow. There was a place called the Grave di Papadopoli, Papadopoli, where it was plenty tricky. He knew how boring any man's war is to any other man, and he stopped talking about it. They always take it personally, he thought. No one is interested in it, abstractly, except the soldiers, and there are not many soldiers. You make them, and the good ones are killed. And above they are always bucking for something so hard they never look or listen. They are always thinking of what they have seen, and while you are talking, they are thinking of what they will say and what it may lead to in their advancement or their privilege. There was no sense boring this boy, who, for all his combat infantryman badge, his purple heart, and the other things he wore, was in no sense a soldier, but only a man placed against his will in uniform, who had elected to remain in the army for his own ends. What did you do in civil life, Jackson? He asked. I was partners with my brother in a garage in Rawlins, Wyoming, sir. Are you going back there? My brother got killed in the Pacific, and the guy who was running the garage was no good, the driver said. We lost, but we lost what we had put in it. That's bad, the colonel said. You're goddamn right it's bad, the driver said, and added, sir. The colonel looked up the road. He knew that if they kept on this road, they would come shortly to the turn that he was waiting for, but he was impatient. Keep your eyes open and take a left-hand turn on the road leading off this pike, he told the driver. Do you think those low roads will be good with this big car, sir? We'll see, the colonel said. Hell, man, hasn't rained in 3 weeks. I don't trust those side roads in this low country. If we get stuck, I'll haul you out with oxen. I was only thinking about the car, sir. Well, think about what I told you and turn off on the first left side road you see if it looks practicable. That looks like one coming up from the hedges, the driver said. You're all clear behind. Pull up just ahead of it, and I'll go over and have a look. He stepped out of the car and walked across the wide, hard-surfaced road and looked at the narrow dirt road with the swift-flowing canal beside it and the thick hedge beyond. Beyond the hedge, he saw a low red farmhouse with a big barn. The road was dry. There were not even cart ruts sunk in it. He got back into the car. It's a boulevard, he said. Quit worrying. Yes, sir. It's your car, sir. I know, the colonel said. I'm still paying for it. Say, Jackson, do you always suffer so much any time you go off a highway onto a secondary road? No, sir. There's a lot of difference between a Jeep and a car as low-hung as this. You know the clearance you have on your differential and your body frame on this? I've got a shovel in the trunk, and we've got chains. Wait till you see where we're going after we leave Venice. Do we go all the way in this car? I don't know. I'll see. Think about your fenders, sir. We'll cut the fenders off like the Indians do in Oklahoma. She's over fendered right now. She's got too much of everything except engine. Jackson, that's a real engine she's got. 150 ponies. It certainly is, sir. It's a great pleasure to drive that big engine on the good roads. That's why I don't want anything to happen to her. That's very good of you, Jackson. Now just quit suffering. I'm not suffering, sir. Good, said the colonel. He was not either, because just then he saw, beyond the line of close bunched brown trees ahead, a sail moving along. It was a big red sail, raked sharply down from the peak, and it moved slowly behind the trees. I should always move your heart to see a sail moving along through the country, the colonel thought. Why does it move my heart to see the great, slow, pale oxen? It must be the gait, as well as the look of them, and the size, and the color. But a good fine big mule, or a string of pack mules in good condition, moves me too. So does a coyote every time I ever see one, and a wolf, gaited like no other animal, gray and sure of himself, carrying that heavy head, and with the hostile eyes. Ever seen any wolves out around Rawlins, Jackson? No, sir. Wolves were gone before my time. They poisoned them out. Plenty coyotes, though. Do you like coyotes? I like to hear them nights. So do I. Better than anything, except seeing a ship sailing along through the country. There's a boat doing that over there, sir. On the Sile Canal, the colonel told him. She's a sailing barge going to Venice. This wind is off the mountains now, and she makes it along pretty good. It's liable to turn really cold tonight if this wind holds, and it ought to bring in plenty ducks. Turn to your left here, and we'll run along the canal. There's a good road. They didn't have much duck shooting where I came from, but there was plenty of it in Nebraska, along the Platte. Do you want to shoot where we're going? I don't believe so, sir. I'm not much of a shot, and I'd rather stay in that sack. It's a Sunday morning, you know. I know, the colonel said. You can stay in the sack until noon if you want. I brought my repellent. I ought to sleep okay. I'm not sure you'll need it, the colonel said. Did you bring any K rations? Or 10 in one? They're liable to eat Italian food, you know. I brought a few cans to help out and a little stuff to give away. That's good, the colonel said. He was looking ahead now to see where the canal road joined the main highway again. There he knew that he would see it on a clear day such as this was. Across the marshes, brown as those at the mouths of the Mississippi around Pilot Town are in winter, and with their reeds bent by the heavy north wind, he saw the squared tower of the church of Torcello and the high campanile of Burano beyond it. The sea was a slate blue, and he could see the sails of 12 sailing barges running with the wind for Venice. I'll have to wait until we cross the Dees River above Noghera to see it perfectly, he thought. It is strange to remember how we fought back there along the canal that winter to defend it, and we never saw it. Then, one time, I was back as far as Noghera when it was clear and cold like today, and I saw it across the river, but I never got into it. It is my city, though, because I fought for it when I was a boy, And now that I am half 100 years old, they know I fought for it and am a part owner, and they treat me well. Do you think that's why they treat you well? He asked himself. Maybe, he thought. Maybe they treat me well because I'm a chicken colonel on the winning side. I don't believe it, though. I hope not, anyway. It is not Florence, he thought. There, you fight your way into a city that you love and are very careful about breaking anything, and then if you have good sense, you are careful not to go back because you will meet some military characters who will resent you having fought your way in. Vive la France et les pommes de terre frites, liberté, banalité et stupidité. The great clarté of the French military thinking. They haven't had a military thinker since Dupic. He was a poor, bloody colonel, too. Mangin, Maginot, and Gamelin. Take your choice, gentlemen. 3 schools of thought. 1. I hit them on the nose. 2. I hide behind this thing, which does not cover my flank. 3. I hide my head in the sand like an ostrich, confident in the greatness of France as a military power, and then take off. Take off is putting it very cleanly and pleasantly. Sure, he thought. Whenever you oversimplify, you become unjust. Remember all the fine ones in the resistance. Remember Falk. Both fought and organized. And remember how fine the people were. Remember your good friends and remember your deads. Remember plenty things and your best friends again and the finest people that you know. Don't be a bitter nor a stupid. And what has that to do with soldiering as a trade? Cut it out, he told himself. You're on a trip to have fun. Jackson, he said, are you happy? Yes, sir. Good. Shortly we are coming to a view that I want you to see. You only have to take one look at it. The entire operation will be practically painless. I wonder what he's writing me for now, the driver thought. Just because he was a BG, once he knows everything. Just because he was a BG once, he knows everything. It was any good as a BG. Why didn't he hold it? He's been beat up so much, he's slug nutty. There's the view, Jackson, the colonel said. Stop her by the side of the road and we'll take a look. The colonel and the driver walked over to the Venice side of the road and looked across the lagoon that was whipped by the strong, cold wind from the mountains that sharpened all the outlines of buildings so that they were geometrically clear. That's Torcello, directly opposite us, the colonel pointed. That's where the people lived that were driven off the mainland by the Visigoths. They built that church you see there, with the square tower. There were 30,000 people lived there once, and they built that church to honor their Lord and to worship him. Then, after they built it, the mouth of the Sile River silted up, or a big flood changed it, and all that land we came through just now got flooded and started to breed mosquitoes, and malaria hit them. They all started to die. So the elders got together and decided they should pull out to a healthy place that would be defensible with boats, and where the Visigoths and the Lombards and the other bandits couldn't get at them, because these bandits had no sea power. The Torcello boys were all great boatmen, so they took the stones of all their houses in barges like that one we just saw, and they built Venice." He stopped. "Am I boring you, Jackson?" "No, sir. I had no idea who pioneered Venice. It was the boys from Torcello. They were very tough, and they had very good taste in building. They came from a little place up the coast called Caorle. But they drew on all the people from the towns and the farms behind when the Visigoths overran them. It was a Torcello boy who was running arms into Alexandria who located the body of St. Mark and smuggled it out under a load of fresh pork so the infidel customs guards wouldn't check him. This boy brought the remains of St. Mark to Venice, and he's their patron saint. They have a cathedral there to him, but by that time they were trading so far to the east that the architecture is pretty Byzantine for my taste. They never built any better than at the start there in Torcello. That's Torcello there. It was indeed. St. Mark's Square is where the pigeons are, and where they have that big cathedral that looks sort of like a moving picture palace, isn't it? Right, Jackson? You're on the ball. If that's the way you look at it. Now you look beyond Torcello, you will see the lovely campanile on Burano that has damn near as much list on it as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. That Burano is a very overpopulated little island where the women make wonderful lace and the men make bambinis and work daytimes in the glass factories. And the next island you see on beyond with the other campanile, which is Murano. They make wonderful glass daytimes for the rich of all the world. And then they come home on the little vaporetto and make bambinis. Not everyone passes every night with his wife, though. They hunt ducks nights, too, with big punt guns out along the edge of the marshes on this lagoon you're looking across now. All night long, on a moonlight night, you hear the shots. He paused. Now, when you look past Murano, you see Venice. That's my town. There's plenty more I could show you, but I think we probably ought to roll now. But take one good look at it. This is where you can see how it all happened, but nobody ever looks at it from here. It's a beautiful view. Thank you, sir. Okay, the colonel said. Let's roll. Five. But he continued to look at it. But he continued to look, and it was all as wonderful to him, and it moved him, as it had when he was 18 years old, and had seen it first, understanding nothing of it, and only knowing that it was beautiful. The winter had come very cold that year, and all the mountains were white beyond the plain. It was necessary for the Austrians to try to break through at the angle where the Sile River and the old bed of the Piave were the only lines of defense. If you had the old bed of the Piave, then you had the Sile to fall back on if the first line did not hold. Beyond the Sile, there was nothing but bare-assed plain and a good road network into the Veneto plain and the plains of Lombardy. And the Austrians attacked again and again late through the winter to try to get onto this fine road that they were rolling on now, which led straight to Venice. That winter, the colonel, who was a lieutenant then, and in a foreign army, which had always made him slightly suspect afterwards in his own army, and had done his career no good, had a sore throat all winter. This sore throat was from being in the water so much. You could not get dry, and it was better to get wet quickly and stay wet. The Austrian attacks were ill coordinated, but they were constant and exasperated, and you first had the heavy bombardment, which was supposed to put you out of business, and then, when it lifted, you checked your positions and continued and counted the people, but you had no time to care for wounded, since you knew that the attack was coming immediately, and then you killed the men who came wading across the marshes, holding their rifles above the water, and coming as slow as men wade, waist deep. If they did not lift the shelling when it started, the colonel, then a lieutenant, often thought, "Do not know what we would be able to do," but then always lifted it and moved it back ahead of the attack. They went by the book. If we had lost the old Piave and were on the Sile, they would move it back to the second and third lines, although such lines were quite untenable, and they should have brought all their guns up very close and whammed it in all the time they attacked and until they breached us. But thank God, some high fool always controls it, the colonel thought. And they did it piecemeal. All that winter, with a bad sore throat, he had killed men who came wearing the stick bombs hooked up on a harness under their shoulders with the heavy calf hide packs and the bucket helmets. They were the enemy, but he never hated them, nor could have any feeling about them. He commanded with an old sock around his throat, which had been dipped in turpentine, and they broke down the attacks with rifle fire and with the machine guns, which still existed or were usable after the bombardment. He taught his people to shoot, really, which is a rare ability in continental troops, and to be able to look at the enemy when they came. And because there was always a dead moment when the shooting was free, they became very good at it. But you also had to count, and count fast after the bombardment, to know how many shooters you would have. He was hit 3 times that winter, but they were all gift wounds, small wounds in the flesh. Of the body without breaking bone. And he had become quite confident of his personal immortality, since he knew he should have been killed in the heavy artillery bombardment that always preceded the attacks. Finally, he did get hit properly, and for good. No one of his other wounds had ever done to him what the first big one did. I suppose it is just the loss of the immortality, he thought. Well, in a way, that is quite a lot to lose. This country meant very much to him, more than he could or would ever tell anyone. And now he sat in the car, happy that in another half hour they would be in Venice. He took 2 mannitol hexanitrate tablets. Since he had always been able to spit since 1918, he could take them dry, and asked, "How are you doing, Jackson?" "Fine, sir. Take the left outside road when we hit the fork for Mestre, and we'll be able to see the boats along the canal and miss that main traffic." "Yes, sir," the driver said. "Will you check me on the fork?" "Of course," the colonel said. They were coming up on Mestre fast, and already it was like going to New York the first time you were ever there in the old days when it was shining, white, and beautiful. I stole that, he thought, but that was before the smoke. We were coming into my town, he thought. Christ, what a lovely town. They made the left turn and came along the canal where the fishing boats tied up, and the colonel looked at them. His heart was happy because of the brown nets and the wicker fish traps and the clean, beautiful lines on the boats. It's not that they are picturesque. The hell with picturesque. They're just damned beautiful. They passed the long line of boats in the slow canal that carried water from the Brenta, and he thought about the long stretch of the Brenta, where the great villas were, with their lawns and their gardens and the plain trees and the cypresses. I'd like to be buried out there, he thought. I know the place very well. I don't believe you could fix it, though. I don't know. I know some people that might let me be buried on their place. I'll ask Alberto. He might think it was morbid, though. For a long time he had been thinking about all the fine places he would like to be buried, and what parts of the earth he would like to be a part of. The stinking, putrefying part doesn't last very long, really, he thought. And anyway, you are just sort of mulch, and even the bones will be some use finally. I'd like to be buried way out at the edge of the grounds, but in sight of the old graceful house and the tall, great trees. I don't think it would be much of a nuisance to them. I could be a part of the ground where the children play in the evenings, and in the mornings, maybe. They would still be training, jumping horses, and their hoofs would make the thudding on the turf, and trout would rise in the pool when there was a hatch of fly. They were up on the causeway from Mestre to Venice now, with the ugly Breda works that might have been Hammond, India. What do they make there, sir? Jackson asked. The company makes locomotives in Milan, the colonel said. Here they make a little of everything in the metallurgic line. It was a miserable view of Venice now, and he always disliked this causeway, except that you made such good time, and you could see the buoys and the channels. This town makes a living on its own, he said to Jackson. She used to be the queen of the seas, and the people are very tough, and they give less of a good goddamn about things than almost anybody you'll ever meet. It's a tougher town than Cheyenne when you really know it, and everybody is very polite. I wouldn't say Cheyenne was a tough town, sir. Well, it's tougher than it's a tougher town than Casper. You think that's a tough town, sir? It's an oil town. It's a nice town. But I don't think it's tough, sir, or ever was. Okay, Jackson, maybe we move in different circles, or maybe we have a differing definition for the word. But this town of Venice, with everybody being polite and having good manners, is as tough as Cook City, Montana, on the day they have the old timers fish fry. My idea of a tough town is Memphis. Not like Chicago, Jackson. Memphis is only tough if you are a Negro. Chicago is tough. North, south, there isn't any east and west. But nobody has any manners. But in this country, if you ever want to know a really tough town, where they eat wonderfully too, go to Bologna. I never was there. Well, there's the Fiat garage where we leave this car, the colonel said. You can leave the key at the office. They don't steal. I'll go in the bar while you park upstairs. They have people that will bring the bags. Is it okay to leave your gun and shooting gear in the trunk, sir? Sure, they don't steal here. I told you that once. I wanted to take the necessary precautions, sir, on your valuable property. You're so damned noble that sometimes you stink, the colonel said. Get the wax out of your ears and hear what I say the first time. I heard you, sir, Jackson said. The colonel looked at him contemplatively and with the old deadliness. He sure is a mean son of a bitch, Jackson thought. And he can be so goddamn nice. Get my and your bag out and park her up there and check your oil, your water, and your tires, the colonel said, and walked across the oil and rubber-stained cement of the entry of the bar. Chapter 6. In the bar, sitting at the first table as he came in, there was a post-war rich from Milan, fat and hard as only Milanese can be, sitting with his expensive-looking and extremely desirable mistress. They were drinking Negronis, a combination of two sweet vermouths and seltzer water, and the colonel wondered how much taxes the man had escaped to buy that sleek girl in her long mink coat and the convertible he had seen the chauffeur take up the long winding ramp to lock away. The pair stared at him with the bad manners of their kind, and he saluted lightly and paid to them in Italian, I am sorry that I am in uniform, but it is uniform, not a costume. Then he turned his back on them, without waiting to see the effect of his remark, and walked to the bar. From the bar you could watch your luggage just as well as the two Pescecani were watching theirs. He is probably a commendatore, he thought. She is a beautiful, hard piece of work. She is damned beautiful, actually. I wonder what it would have been like if I had ever had the money to buy me that kind and put them into the mink. I'll settle for what I have, he thought, and they can go hang themselves. The bartender shook hands with him. This bartender was an anarchist, but he did not mind the colonel being a colonel at all. He was delighted by it and proud and loving about it, as though the anarchists had a colonel too. And in some ways, in the several months that they had known each other, he seemed to feel that he had invented, or at least erected, the colonel, as you might be happy about participating in the erection of a campanile, or even the old church at Torcello. The bartender had heard the conversation, or rather the flat statement, at the table, and he was very happy. He had already sent down via the dumb waiter for a Gordon's gin and Campari, and he said, "It is coming up in that hand-pulled device. How does everything go at Trieste?" "About as you would imagine." "I couldn't even imagine." "Then don't strain," the colonel said, "and you will never get piles." I wouldn't mind if I was a colonel. I never mind it. You'd be run over like a dose of salts, the waiter said. Don't tell the Honorable Pecciardi, the colonel said. He and the bartender had a joke about this because the Honorable Pacciardi was Minister of Defense in the Italian Republic. He was the same age as the colonel and had fought very well in the First World War and had also fought in Spain as a battalion commander, where the colonel had known him when he himself was an observer. The seriousness with which the Honorable Pacciardi took the post of Minister of Defense of an indefensible country was a bond between the colonel and the bartender. The two of them were quite practical men, and the vision of the Honorable Pacciardi defending the Italian Republic stimulated their minds. Sort of funny up there, the colonel said, and I don't mind it. We must mechanize the Honorable Pacciardi, the bartender said, and supply him with the atomic bomb. I've got 3 of them in the back of the car, the colonel said. A new model, complete with handles, but we can't leave him unarmed. We must supply him with botulism and anthrax. We cannot fail the Honorable Pacciardi, the bartender said. Better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep. Better to die on our feet than live on our knees, the colonel said. Though you better get on your belly damn fast if you want to stay alive in plenty places. Colonel, don't say anything subversive. We will strangle them with our bare hands, the colonel said. 1,000,000 men will spring to arms overnight. Whose arms? The bartender asked. All that will be attended to, the colonel said. It's only a phase in the big picture. Just then the driver came in the door. The colonel saw that while they had been joking, he had not watched the door, and he was annoyed. Always, with any lapse of vigilance or of security. What the hell's been keeping you, Jackson? Have a drink. No, thank you, sir. You prissy jerk, the colonel thought. But I better stop riding him, he corrected. We'll be going in a minute, the colonel said. I've been trying to learn Italian from my friend here. He turned to look at the Milan profiteers, but they were gone. I'm getting awfully slow, he thought. Somebody will take me any day now. Maybe even the Honorable Pacciardi, he thought. How much do I owe you? He asked the bartender shortly. The bartender told him and looked at him with his wise Italian eyes, not merry now, although the lines of merriment were clearly cut where they radiated from the corners of each eye. I hope there's nothing wrong with him, the bartender thought. I hope to God, or anything else, there's nothing really bad. Goodbye, my colonel, he said. Ciao, the colonel said. Jackson, we are going down the long ramp and due north from the exit to where the small launches are moored. The varnished ones. There is a porter with the 2 bags. It is necessary to let them carry them since they have a concession. Yes, sir, said Jackson. The 2 of them went out the door, and no one looked back at anyone. At the Embarcadero, the colonel tipped the man who had carried their 2 bags and then looked around for a boatman he knew. He did not recognize the man in the launch that was first on call, but the boatman said, Good day, my colonel. I'm the first. How much is it to the gritty? You know as well as I, my colonel. We do not bargain. We have a fixed tariff. What's the tariff? 3,500. We could go on the Vaporetto for 60. And nothing prevents you going, the boatman, who was an elderly man with a red but choleric face, said, "They won't let you to the Gritty, but they will stop at the Embarcadero past Harry's, and you can telephone for someone from the Gritty to get your bags." And what would I buy with a goddamn 3,500 lire? Liar. And this is a good old man. "Do you want me to send that man there?" He pointed to a destroyed old man who did odd jobs and ran errands around the docks, always ready with the unneeded aid to the elbow of the ascending or descending passenger, always ready to help when no help was needed. His old felt had held out as he bowed after the unneeded act. "He'll take you to the Vaporetto. There's one in 20 minutes. "Hell with it," the colonel said. "Take us to the Gritty." "Con piacere. Piacere. Con piacere," the boatman said. The colonel and Jackson lowered themselves into the launch, which looked like a speedboat. It was radiantly varnished and lovingly kept, and was powered with a marine conversion of a tiny Fiat engine that had served its allotted time in the car of a provincial doctor, and had been purchased out of one of the graveyards of automobiles, those mechanical elephant cemeteries that are the one certain thing you may find in our world near any populated center, and been reconditioned and reconverted to start this new life on the canals of this city. "How is this motor doing?" the colonel asked. You could hear her sounding like a stricken tank or TD, except the noises were in miniature form from the lack of power. So, the boatman said. He moved his free hand in a parallel motion. You ought to get the smallest model universal puts out. That's the best and lightest small marine engine I know. Yes, the boatman said. There are quite a few things I should get. Maybe you'll have a good year. It's always possible. Lots of Pescicani come down from Milano to gamble at the Lido. But nobody would ride twice in this thing on purpose. As a boat, it is fine, too. It is a well-built, pleasant boat. Not beautiful as a gondola is, of course, but it needs an engine. I might get you a Jeep engine, one that was condemned, and you could work it over. Don't talk of such things, the boatman said. Things like that don't happen. I don't want to think about it. You can think about it, the colonel said. I'm talking true. You mean it? Sure. I don't guarantee anything. I'll see what I can do. How many children have you got? 6. 2 male and 4 female. Hell, you mustn't have believed in the regime. Only 6? I didn't believe in the regime. You don't have to give me that stuff, the colonel said. It would have been quite natural for you to have believed in it. Do you think I hold that against a man after we've won? They were through the dull part of the canal that runs from Piazzale Roma to Ca' Foscari. Though none of it is dull, the colonel thought. It doesn't all have to be palaces nor churches. Certainly that isn't dull. He looked to the right, to the starboard. He thought. On the water was a long, low, pleasant building, and there was a trattoria next to it. I ought to live here. On retirement pay, I could make it all right. No gritty palace. A room in a house like that, and the tides and the boats going by. I could read in the mornings and walk around town before lunch and go every day to see the Tintorettos at the Accademia and to the Scuola San Rocco, San Rocco, and eat in good cheap joints behind the market, or maybe the woman that ran the house would cook in the evenings. I think it would be better to have lunch and get some exercise walking. It's a good town to walk in. I guess the best, probably. I never walked in it that it wasn't fun. I could learn it really well, he thought, and then I'd have that. It's a strange, tricky town, and to walk from any part to any other part, any other given part of it, is better than working crossword puzzles. It's one of the few things to our credit that we never smacked it, and to their credit that they respected it. Christ, I love it, he said, and I'm so happy I helped defend it when I was a punk kid and with an insufficient command of the language, and I never even saw her until that clear day in the winter when I went back to have that small wound dressed and saw her rising from the sea. Merde, he thought. We did very well that winter up there, up at the juncture. I wish I could fight it again, he thought, knowing what I know now and having what we have now. But they'd expect it too, and the essential problem is just the same. Except who holds the air? And all this time, he had been watching the bow of the beat-up, beautifully varnished, delicately striped boat with the brass all beautifully polished, cut the brown water, and seen the small traffic problems. They went under the white bridge and under the unfinished wood bridge. Then they left the red bridge on the right and passed under the first high-flying white bridge. Then there was the black iron fretwork bridge on the canal leading into the Rio Nuovo, and they passed the two stakes chained together but not touching. Like us, the colonel thought. We watched the tide pull at them. He watched the tide pull at them, and he saw how the chains had worn the wood since he first had seen them. That's us, he thought. That's our monument. How many monuments are there to us in the canals of this town? Then they still went slowly until the great lantern that was on the right of the entrance to the Grand Canal, where the engine commenced its metallic agony, that produced a slight increase in speed. Now they came down and under the Accademia, between the pilings where they passed, at touching distance, a heavily loaded black diesel boat full of cut timber, cut in chunks to burn for firewood in the damp houses of the sea city. That's beech, isn't it? The colonel asked the boatman. Beech, and another wood that is cheaper, that I do not recall at this moment the name of. Beech is to an open fire as anthracite coal is to a stove. Where do they cut that beech? I'm not a man of the mountains, but I think it comes from up beyond Bassano, on the other side of the Grappa. I went there to the Grappa to see where my brother was buried. It was an excursion that they made from Bassano, and we went to the big Osario, but we returned by Feltre. I could see it was a fine timber country on the other side as you came down the mountains into the valley. We came down that military road, and they were hauling lots of wood. And what year was your brother killed on Grappa? In 1918. He was a patriot and inflamed by hearing the Anunzio talk, and he volunteered before his class was called. We never knew him very well because he went so quickly. How many were you in the family? We were 6. We lost 2 beyond the Isonzo, 1 on the Baincisa, and 1 on the Carso. Then we lost this brother I speak of on the Grappa, and I remained. I'll get you that goddamn Jeep complete with handles, the colonel said. Now let's not be morbid and look for all the places where my friends live. They were moving up the Grand Canal now, and it was easy to see where your friends lived. That's the house of Contessa Dandolo, the colonel said. He did not say, but thought, she is over 80, and she is as gay as a girl and does not have any fear of dying. She dyes her hair red, and it looks very well. She is a good companion and an admirable woman. Her palazzo was pleasant looking, set well back from the canal, with a garden in front and a landing place of its own where many gondolas had come in their various times, bringing hearty, cheerful, sad, and disillusioned people. But most of them had been cheerful because they were going to see the Contessa Dandolo. Now, beating up the canal against the cold wind off the mountains, and with the houses as clear and sharp as on a winter day, which, of course, it was, they saw the old magic of the city and its beauty. But it was conditioned for the colonel by his knowing many of the people who lived in the palazzos, or if no one lived there now, knowing to what use the different places had been put. There's Alvarito's mother's house, he thought, and did not say. She never lives there much, and stays out at the country house near Treviso, where they have trees. She's tired of there not being trees in Venice. She lost a fine man, and nothing really interests her now except efficiency. But the family at one time lent the house to George Gordon, Lord Byron, and nobody sleeps now in Byron's bed, nor in the other bed, 2 flights below, where he used to sleep with the gondolier's wife. They are not sacred nor relics. They are just extra beds that were not used afterwards for various reasons, or possibly to respect Lord Byron, who was well loved in this town, in spite of all the errors he committed. You have to be a tough boy in this town to be loved, the colonel thought. They never cared anything for Robert Browning, nor Mrs. Robert Browning, nor for their dog. They weren't Venetians, no matter how well he wrote of it. And what is a tough boy, he asked himself. You use it so loosely, you should be able to define it. I suppose as a man who will make his play and then backs it up. Or just a man who backs his play. And I'm not thinking of the theater, he thought, lovely as the theater can be. And yet, he thought, seeing now the little villa close up against the water, ugly as a building you would see on the boat train from Havre to Cherbourg, coming into the Banlieue before Paris as you came into town. It was overrun with badly administered trees, and not a place that you would live in if you could help it. There he lived. They loved him for his talent and because he was bad and he was brave. A Jewish boy with nothing, he stormed this country with his talent and his rhetoric. He was a more miserable character than any that I know, and as mean. But the man I think of to compare him with never puts the chips on the line. Never put the chips on the line and went to war, the colonel thought. And Gabriele de Annunzio, I always wondered what his real name was, he thought, because nobody is named de Annunzio in a practical country, and perhaps he was not Jewish, and what difference did it make if he was or was not, had moved through the different arms of the service as he had moved into and out of the arms of different women. All the arms were pleasant that de Annunzio served with, and the mission was fast and easily over, except the infantry. He remembered how de Annunzio had lost an eye in a crash flying as an observer from Trieste or Pola, and how afterwards he had always worn a patch over it, and people who did not know, for then no one really knew, thought it had been shot out at the Veliki or San Michael or some other bad place beyond the Carso where everyone died or was incapacitated that you knew. But de Annunzio truly was only making heroic gestures with the other things. An infantryman knows a strange trade, he thought, perhaps the strangest. He, Gabriele, flew, but he was not a flyer. He was in the infantry, but he was not an infantryman, and it was always the same appearances. And the colonel remembered one time when he had stood commanding a platoon of assault troops while it was raining in one of the interminable winters when the rain fell always, or at least always when there was parades or speeches to the troops, and de Annunzio, with his lost eye, covered by the patch, and his white face, as white as the belly of a soul, new turned over in the market, the brown side not showing, and looking 30 hours dead, was shouting, Morir non e basta. And the colonel, then a lieutenant, had thought, what the muck more do they want of us? But he had followed the discourse, and at the end, when the lieutenant colonel de Annunzio, writer and national hero, certified and true if you must have heroes, and the colonel did not believe in heroes, asked for a moment of silence for our glorious dead. He had stood stiffly at attention, but his platoon, who had not followed the speech, there being no loudspeakers then, and they being slightly out of hearing of the orator, responded as one man at the pause for the moment of silence for our glorious dead with a solid and ringing Vive de Annunzio. They had been addressed before by de Annunzio, after victories and before defeats, and they knew what they should shout if there was any pause by an orator. The colonel, being then a lieutenant and loving his platoon, had joined with them and uttered, with the tone of command, Vive de Annunzio, thus absolving all those who had not listened to the discourse, speech, or harangue, and attempting, in the small way a lieutenant can attempt anything, except to hold an indefensible position, or intelligently direct his own part in an attack, to share their guilt. But now he was passing the house where the poor beat-up old boy had lived with his great, sad, and never properly loved actress, and he thought of her wonderful hands, and her so transformable face that was not beautiful, but that gave you all love, glory, and delight, and sadness, and of the way the curve of her forearm could break your heart. And he thought, Christ, they are dead, and I do not know where either one is buried even. But I certainly hope they had fun in that house. Jackson, he said, that small villa on the left belonged to Gabriele de Annunzio. He was a great writer. Gabriel de Annunzio. Yes, sir, said Jackson. I'm glad to know about him. I never heard of him. I'll check you out on what he wrote if you ever want to read him, the colonel said. There are some fair English translations. Thank you, sir, said Jackson. I'd like to read him any time I have time. He has a nice, practical-looking place. What did you say his name was? De Annunzio, the colonel said. Writer. He added to himself, not wishing to confuse Jackson, nor be difficult, as he had been with the man several times that day. Writer, poet, national hero, phraser of the dialect of fascism, of the dialectic of fascism, macabre egotist, aviator, commander, or rider in the first of the fast torpedo attack boats, lieutenant colonel of infantry without knowing how to command or a company nor a platoon properly, the great, lovely rider of Naturuno, whom we respect, and jerk. Up ahead now, there was a crossing place of gondolas at the Santa Maria del Giglio, and beyond was the wooden dock of the Gritty. That's the hotel where we are stopping at, Jackson. The colonel indicated the 3-story, rose-colored, small, pleasant palace abutting on the canal. It had been a dependence of the Grand Hotel, but now it was its own hotel, and a very good one. It was probably the best hotel, if you did not wish to be fawned on, or fussed over, or over-flunkied in a city of great hotels, and the colonel loved it. It looks okay to me, sir, Jackson said. It is okay, the colonel said. The motorboat came gallantly up beside the piling of the dock. Every move she makes, the colonel thought, is a triumph of the gallantry of the aging machine. We do not have war horses now like Old Traveler or Morbot's Lysette, who fought personally at Eylau. We have the gallantry of worn-through rods that refuse to break, the cylinder head that does not blow, though it has every right to, and the rest of it. We're at the dock, sir, Jackson said. Where the hell else would we be, man? Jump out while I settle with this sportsman. He turned to the boatswain and said, That was 3,500, wasn't it? Yes, my colonel. I'll not forget about the overaged Jeep engine. Take this and buy your horse some oats. The porter who was taking the bags from Jackson heard this and laughed. No veterinarian will ever fix his horse. She still runs, the boatman said. She doesn't win any races, the porter said. How are you, my colonel? I couldn't be better, the colonel said. How are all the members of the order? All members are well. Good, said the colonel. I will go in and see the Grand Master. He is waiting for you, my colonel. Let us not keep him waiting, Jackson, the colonel said. You may proceed to the lobby with this gentleman and tell them to sign me in. See the sergeant gets a room, he said to the porter. We're here for the night only. The Baron Alvarito was here looking for you. I'll find him at Harry's. Good, my colonel. Where is the Grand Master? I'll find him for you. Tell him I'll be in the bar. The bar was just across, Chapter 7. The bar was just across from the lobby of the Gritty, although lobby, the colonel thought, was not the accurate term to describe that gracious entrance. Didn't Giotto describe a circle, he thought? No, that was in math. What he remembered and loved best as an anecdote about the painter was, "It was easy," said Giotto, as he drew the perfect circle. Who the hell had said that, and where? Good evening, Privy Councillor, he said to the barman, who was not a full paid-up member of the order, but whom he did not wish to offend. What can I do for you? Drink, my colonel. The colonel looked out of the windows and the door of the bar onto the waters of the Grand Canal. He could see the big black hitching post for the gondolas and the late afternoon winter light on the wind-swept water. Across the canal was the old palace, and a wood barge, black and broad, was coming up the canal, her bluff bows pushing up a wave, even though she had the wind behind her. Make it a very dry martini, the colonel said. A double. Just then, the Grand Master came into the room. He was wearing his formal attire as a head waiter. He was truly handsome, as a man should be from the inside out, so that his smile starts from his heart, or whatever is the center of the body, and comes frankly and beautifully to the surface, which is the face. He had a fine face, with the long, straight nose of his part of the Veneto, the kind, gay, truthful eyes, and honorable white hair of his age, which was 2 years older than that of the colonel. He had advanced, smiling, lovingly, and yet conspiratorially, since they both shared many secrets, and he extended his hand, which was a big, long, strong, spatula-fingered hand, well kept, as was becoming, as well as necessary, to his position, and the colonel extended his own hand, which had been shot through twice and was slightly misshapen. Thus contact was made between two old inhabitants of the Veneto, both men, and brothers in their membership in the human race, only club that either one paid dues to, and brothers, too, in their love of an old country, much fought over, and always triumphant in defeat, which they had both defended in their youth. Their handshake was only long enough to feel firmly the contact and the pleasure of meeting, and then the maitre d'hotel said, "My colonel." The colonel said, "Grand Maestro." Then the colonel asked the Grand Maestro to accompany him in a drink, but the maitre d'hotel said that he was working. It was impossible as well as forbidden. "Fornicate forbidden," said the colonel. "Of course," the Grand Maestro said, "but everyone must comply with his duty. And here the rules are reasonable, and we all should comply with them, me especially, as a matter of precept." "Not for nothing are you the Grand Maestro," the colonel said. "Give me a small Carpano Punte e Mezzo," the Grand Maestro said to the bartender. He was still outside of the order for some small, not defined, unstated reason, to drink to the ordain. Thus, violating orders and the principle of precept and example in command, the colonel and the Grand Maestro downed a quick one. They did not hurry, nor did the Grand Maestro worry. They simply made it fast. "Now, let us discuss the affairs of the order," the colonel said. "Are we in the secret chamber?" "We are," said the Grand Maestro, "where I declare it to be such." "Continue," said the colonel. The order, which was a purely fictitious organization, had been founded in a series of conversations between the Grand Maestro and the colonel. Its name was El Ordine Militar Nobil y Spirituoso de los Caballeros de Brusadelli. The colonel and the head waiter both spoke Spanish, and since that is the best language for founding orders, they had used it in the name of this one, which was named after a particularly notorious multimillionaire, non-tax-paying profiteer of Milan, who had, in the course of a dispute over property, accused his young wife, publicly and legally, through due process of law, of having deprived him of his judgment through her extraordinary sexual demands. "Grand Maestro," the colonel said, "have you heard from our leader, the revered one?" "Not a word. He is silent these days. He must be thinking." "He must. Perhaps he is meditating on new and more distinguished shameful acts. Perhaps he has not given me any word. But we can have confidence in him until he dies," the Grand Maestro said. "After that, he can roast in hell, and we will revere his memory." "Giorgio," the colonel said, "give the Grand Maestro another short Carpano." "If it is your order," the Grand Maestro said, "I can only obey." They touched glasses. "Jackson," the colonel called, "you're on the town. You can sign here for chow. I don't want to see you until 1100 tomorrow in the lobby unless you get into trouble. Do you have money?" "Yes, sir," Jackson said, and thought, the old son of a bitch really is as crazy as they say, but he might have called me instead of shouting. "I don't want to see you," the colonel said. Jackson had entered the room and stood before him at a semblance of attention. "I am tired of seeing you, because you worry and you don't have fun. For Christ's sake, have yourself some fun." "Yes, sir." "You understand what I said?" "Yes, sir." "Repeat it." "Ronald Jackson, T5, serial number 100678, will present himself in this lobby of the Gritty Hotel at 1100 tomorrow morning. I don't know the date, sir, and will absent himself from the colonel's sight and will have some fun. Or, he added, will make every reasonable attempt to attain that objective. I'm sorry, Jackson, the colonel said. I'm a shit. I beg to differ with the colonel, Jackson said. Thank you, Jackson, the colonel told him. Maybe I'm not. I hope you are correct. Now, muck off. You've got a room here, or you should have, and you can sign for chow. Now try and have some fun. Yes, sir, said Jackson. When he was gone, the Grand Maestro said to the colonel, What is the boy, one of those sad Americans? Yes, the colonel said. And by Jesus Christ, we've got a lot of them. Sad, self-righteous, overfed, and undertrained. And they are undertrained. It is my fault. If they are undertrained, it is my fault. But we've got some good ones, too. Do you think they would have done grappa, pasubio, and the bazo piave as we did? The good ones, yes. Maybe better. But you know, in our army, they don't even shoot for self-inflicted wounds. Jesus, said the Grand Maestro. He and the colonel both remembered the men who decided that they did not wish to die, not thinking that he who dies on Thursday does not have to die on Friday, and how one soldier would wrap another's putied leg in a sandbag so there would be no powder burns, and loose off at his friend from as far a distance as he figured he could hit the calf of the leg without hitting bone, and then fire twice over the parapet to alibi the shot. They had this knowledge shared between them, and it was for this reason, and for a true good hatred of all those who profited by war, that they had founded the order. They knew, the two of them, who loved and respected each other, how poor boys who did not want to die would share the contents of a matchbox full of gonorrheal pus to produce the infection that would keep them from the next murderous frontal attack. They knew about the other boys who put the big 10 centime pieces under their armpits to produce jaundice. And they knew, too, about the richer boys who, in different cities, had paraffin injected under their kneecaps so they would not have to go to the war. They knew how garlic could be used to produce certain effects which could absent a man from an attack, and they knew all, or nearly all, of the other tricks, for one had been a sergeant and the other a lieutenant of infantry, and they had fought on the three key points, pasubio, grappa, and the piave, where it all made sense. They had fought, too, in the earlier stupid butchery on the Inzonzo in the Carso, but they were both ashamed of those who had ordered that, and they never thought about it except as a shameful, stupid thing to be forgotten. And the colonel remembered it technically as something to be learned from. So now they had founded the order of Brisadelli, noble, military, and religious, and there were only 5 members. What is the news of the order? The colonel asked the Grand Maestro. We have ascended the cook at the Magnificent to the rank of Commendatore. He comported himself as a man 3 times on his 50th birthday. I accepted his statement without corroboration. He never lied ever. No, he never lied. But it is a topic on which you must be sherry in your credibility. I believed him. He looked ruined. I can remember him when he was a tough kid, and we called him the Chariot Buster. Anchio. Have you any concrete plans for the Order during the winter? No, Supreme Commander. Do you think we should give homage to the Honorable Picciardi? As you wish. Let's defer it, the Colonel said. He thought a moment and signaled for another dry martini. Do you think we might organize a homage and a manifestation in some historic place such as San Marco or the old church at Torcello in favor of our great patron, Brusadelli, the revered one? I doubt if the religious authorities were permitted at this moment. Then let us abandon all ideas of public manifestations for this winter and work within our cadres for the good of the Order. I think that is soundest, the Grand Maestro said. We will regroup. And how are you yourself? Awful, the Grand Maestro said. I have low blood pressure, ulcers, and I owe money. Are you happy? All the time, the Grand Maestro said. I like my work very much, and I meet extraordinary and interesting characters. Also, many Belgians. They are what we have instead of the locusts this year. Formerly, we had the Germans. What was it Caesar said? And the bravest of these are the Belgians, but not the best dressed. Do you agree? I've seen them quite well costumed in Brussels, the Colonel said. A well-fed, gay capital. Win, lose, or draw. I have never seen them fight, though everyone tells me that they do. We should have fought in Flanders in the old days. We were not born in the old days, the Colonel said. So we automatically could not have fought then. I wish we could have fought with the Condottieri when all you had was to outthink them and they conceded. You could think and I would convey your orders. We'd have to take a few towns for them to respect our thinking. We would sack them if they defended them, the Grand Maestro said. What towns would you take? Not this one, the Colonel said. I'd take Vicenza, Bergamo, and Verona. Not necessarily in that order. You'd have to take 2 more. I know, the Colonel said. He was a general now again, and he was happy. I figured that I'd bypass Brescia. It could fall of its own weight. And how are you, Supreme Commander? The Grand Maestro said, for this taking of towns had pulled him out of his depth. He was at home in his small house in Treviso, close to the fast-flowing river under the old walls. The weeds waved in the current, and the fish hung in the shelter of the weeds and rose to insects that touched the water in dusk. He was at home, too, in all operations that did not involve more than a company, and understood them as clearly as he understood the proper serving of a small dining room, or a large dining room. But when the colonel became a general officer again, he had once been, and thought in terms that were as far beyond him as calculus is distant from a man who has only the knowledge of arithmetic. And he was not at home, and their contact was strained, and he wished the colonel would return to things they both knew together when they were a lieutenant and a sergeant. What would you do about Mantova? The colonel asked. I do not know, my colonel. I do not know whom you are fighting, nor what forces they have, nor what forces are at your disposal. I thought you said we were condottieri. based on this town or on Padova. My colonel, the Grand Maestro said, and he had diminished in no way. I know nothing truly about condottieri, nor really how they fought then. I only said I would like to fight under you in such times. There aren't any such times anymore, the colonel said, and the spell was broken. What the hell? Maybe there never was any spell, the colonel thought. The hell with you, he said to himself. Cut it out and be a human being when you're half 100 years old. Have another Carpano, he said to the Grand Maestro. My colonel, you will allow me to refuse because of the ulcers. Yes, yes, of course. Boy, what's your name? Giorgio? Another dry martini. Secco molto secco e doppio. Breaking spells, he thought. It is not my trade. My trade is killing armed men. A spell should be armed if I am to break it. We have killed many things which were not armed. All right, spell breaker, retract. Grand Maestro, he said, you are still a Grand Maestro, and fornicate the condottieri. They were fornicated many years ago, Supreme Commander. Exactly, the colonel said. The spell was broken. I'll see you at dinner, the colonel said. What is there? We will have anything you wish, and what we do not have, I will send out for. Do you have any fresh asparagus? You know we cannot have it in these months. It comes in April and from Bassano. Then I'll just urinate the usual odor, the colonel said. You think of something and I'll eat it. How many will you be? The maitre d'hotel asked. We'll be two, the colonel said. What time do you close the bistro? We will serve dinner as late as you wish to eat, my colonel. I'll try to be in at a sound hour, the colonel said. Goodbye, Grand Maestro, he said and smiled, and gave the Grand Maestro his crooked hand. Goodbye, Supreme Commander, said the Grand Maestro, and the spell was existent again, and almost complete. But it was not quite complete, and the colonel knew it, and he thought, why am I always a bastard, and why can I not suspend this trade of arms, and be a kind and good man, as I would have wished to be? I try always to be just, but I am brusque, and I am brutal, and it is not that I have erected the defense against brown-nosing my superiors and brown-nosing the world. I should be a better man with less wild boar blood in the small time which remains. We will try it out tonight, he thought, with whom he thought, and where. And God help me not to be bad. Giorgio, he said to the barman, who had a face as white as a leper, but with no bulges, and without the silver shine. Giorgio did not like the colonel very much, or perhaps he was simply from Piemonte, and cared for no one truly, which was understandable in cold people from a border province. Borderers are not trusters, and the colonel knew about this, and expected nothing more from anyone they did not have to give. Giorgio, he said to the pale-faced barman, write these down for me, please. He went out, walking as he had always walked, with a slightly exaggerated confidence, even when it was not needed, and in his always renewed plan of being kind, decent, and good, he greeted the concierge, who was a friend, the assistant manager who spoke Swahili and had been a prisoner of war in Kenya, and was a most amiable man, young, full of juice, handsome, perhaps not yet a member of the order, and experienced. And the Cavalier Ufficiale, who manages this place, he asked. My friend? He's not here, the assistant manager said. For the moment, naturally, he added. Give him my compliments, the colonel said, and have somebody show me to my room. It is the usual room. You still wish it? Yes. Have you taken care of the sergeant? He is well taken care of. Good, said the colonel. The colonel proceeded to his room, accompanied by the boy, and carried his bag. This way, my colonel, the boy said, when the elevator halted with slight hydraulic inaccuracy at the top floor. Can you run an elevator properly? The colonel asked. No, my colonel, the boy said. The current is not stable. Chapter 8. Uh-oh, what happened to the camera? Camera break? It's weird. Just the stream. Oh. I think that's it for now.